The sun beat down on the dusty trail as a lone rider approached the outskirts of Dust Gulch. He was a figure etched from the very landscape. Weathered leather, a low-slung hat casting his face in shadow, and eyes that held a history as turbulent as the Wild West itself. This was Coyote Carson, a name whispered with a mix of fear and grudging respect in saloons from Arizona to Montana. Coyote hadn't set foot in Dust Gulch in nearly a decade, not since his hasty departure following a particularly audacious bank robbery. The memories weren't pleasant, filled with the clang of gunfire, the panicked shouts of townsfolk, and the bitter taste of regret. He'd heard rumors that Dust Gulch had changed, that the rough-and-tumble mining town had begun to tame itself, families moving in, a church being built. He wasn't here to confirm those rumors. He was just passing through, heading west to escape some troubles he'd stirred up further east. As he crested the final ridge overlooking the town, a plume of black smoke rising from the center of town spoiled the image. He spurred his horse forward, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. This wasn't the quiet, reformed Dust Gulch he'd half expected. This was something far worse. The smoke seemed to pull Coyote closer, a dark hand beckoning him into a past he'd tried to bury. Images flashed through his mind, the dusty main street, but younger, filled with eager faces ready to make their fortune. He remembered the glint of gold in the stream, the rowdy saloons, and the boomtown energy that vibrated through Dust Gulch. And then the darker images, the ones he couldn't shake. He saw himself, younger, reckless, full of a swagger born of desperation. He recalled the thrill of his first successful poker game, quickly followed by the addiction. Then the robberies, escalating from petty theft to the ill-fated bank job that forced him to flee. He remembered the faces of the people he'd wronged. Old Man Hemlock, the bank teller he'd pistol-whipped, though he hadn't meant to hit him so hard. Sarah Jenkins, the shopkeeper whose store he'd ransacked. These weren't nameless victims. They were people he'd known, people who had offered him kindness before he threw it back in their faces. He winced, a familiar pang of guilt twisting in his stomach. He wasn't proud of the man he'd been. He tried to justify it to himself. It was a hard life, everyone was looking out for themselves, but the excuses rang hollow. Dust Gulch wasn't just a town. It was a mirror reflecting the worst parts of himself. He almost turned back. The easiest thing to do would be to veer off the trail, disappear into the vast expanse of the desert, and leave Dust Gulch to its fate. He told himself he owed them nothing. He'd paid his dues, hadn't he? By staying away all these years. But as he rode closer, the sounds of the attack became clearer. Not just the crack of gunfire, but the screams of women and children. He saw figures running through the streets, not the hardened miners he remembered, but families, carrying what few possessions they could salvage. He noticed the church he'd heard about, its steeple still standing, but riddled with bullet holes. A small group of people huddled inside, their faces etched with fear. It wasn't the Dust Gulch he remembered. It was vulnerable, innocent in a way it never had been before. He saw a young girl, no older than 7, stumble and fall, dropping a doll in the dirt. A gruff-looking man rushed to help her, his face a mask of desperation. Coyote realized then that this wasn't just about the past. It was about the present and the future of these people, a future that was being stolen from them. He reined in his horse, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his hip. He could still ride away. No one would blame him. But the image of that little girl, her face streaked with tears, stayed with him. Suddenly, a volley of gunfire erupted nearby, snapping Coyote out of his internal debate. He saw a group of men on horseback ride into the town square, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their eyes glinting with malice. They were dressed in black, their weapons gleaming in the harsh sunlight. These weren't just bandits. They were organized, ruthless. At their head rode a man of imposing stature, his face partly obscured by a thick, unkempt beard. But Coyote could see the cruel set of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes. This was Jebediah Blacktooth, a name that even Coyote had heard whispered in hushed tones around campfires. Blacktooth was known for his brutality, his willingness to kill without remorse, and his insatiable greed. Blacktooth raised his hand, signaling his gang to halt. His voice boomed across the town square, silencing the sounds of panic. "All right, folks," he bellowed, his voice laced with menace. "We're here to collect what's rightfully ours. Cooperate, and you might just live to see another sunrise." Coyote watched as the Blacktooth gang began to systematically loot the town, kicking down doors, smashing windows, and terrorizing the inhabitants. He saw Blacktooth himself grab a woman by the arm, demanding to know where she had hidden her valuables. The woman, trembling with fear, pointed to a small wooden box. Blacktooth snatched it away, tossing it to one of his men. The choice before Coyote became agonizingly clear. He could ride away and save himself, or he could stay and face the devil himself. The townspeople offered little resistance. They were farmers, shopkeepers, and families, not hardened gunslingers. A few tried to defend their homes, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the Blacktooth gang's superior firepower and numbers. The air filled with the sounds of shattering glass, terrified screams, and the triumphant shouts of the outlaws. Coyote watched in grim silence as the Blacktooth gang ransacked the general store, tossing goods into sacks and laughing cruelly. He saw them drag the town's elderly doctor from his office, demanding he reveal the location of his hidden stash of money. The doctor, his face pale with fear, swore he had nothing, but Blacktooth merely sneered and signaled one of his men to rough him up. The local sheriff, a portly man named Bart, attempted to intervene, but he was quickly disarmed and humiliated, his badge tossed into the mud. Blacktooth then made a show of stomping on the badge, grinding it into the dirt with his heel. "This town has a new sheriff now," he declared, his voice dripping with disdain. Coyote knew that the situation was rapidly deteriorating. If someone didn't stand up to Blacktooth, Dust Gulch would be left in ruins, its inhabitants at the mercy of a band of ruthless killers. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. The past was the past, but the present demanded action. Still, the old instinct to survive warred with the burgeoning urge to protect. The decision was a heavy weight in his chest. The turning point came when Blacktooth turned his attention to the church. He strode towards it, his boots crunching on the dusty ground, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He kicked open the doors, sending splinters of wood flying, and peered inside. Well, he sneered, his voice echoing in the small space. "Looks like we have a gathering of the faithful. Praying for a miracle, are we?" He spotted the young girl Coyote had seen earlier, clinging to her mother's leg. He reached out and grabbed the doll she had dropped, holding it up for all to see. "Pretty little thing," he said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Shame if something were to happen to it." He ripped the doll's head off, tossing it to the ground. The little girl burst into tears, burying her face in her mother's skirt. The mother, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance, glared at Blacktooth. Blacktooth merely laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent shivers down Coyote's spine. "That's right, lady," he said. "Cry all you want. It won't do you any good." He then turned to his men. "Burn it," he ordered, gesturing towards the church. "Let's see how much faith these people really have." That was it. Something snapped inside Coyote. He couldn't stand by and watch Blacktooth destroy everything these people held dear. The image of the little girl, her innocent joy shattered by Blacktooth's cruelty, was the final straw. He knew what he had to do. He would stay, he would fight, and he would make Blacktooth pay. But Coyote wasn't foolish. He knew he couldn't take on the entire Blacktooth gang alone, not yet. His first priority was to get as many people as possible out of harm's way. He remembered the old mine shafts that ran beneath Dust Gulch, escape routes he'd used himself back in his outlaw days. They were dangerous, unstable in places, but they offered a chance of survival. He slipped into the shadows, moving quickly and silently through the back alleys, avoiding the main street where the Blacktooth gang held sway. He approached the church, staying out of sight, and called out softly, "Anyone in there who wants to live, follow me." A few hesitant faces peered out from the doorway. The mother of the little girl recognized him. She'd heard the stories about Coyote Carson, the outlaw who had terrorized Dust Gulch. but she also saw the determination in his eyes, the grim set of his jaw. She decided to trust him. One by one, the people emerged from the church, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Coyote led them towards the entrance to the old mine, a dark and forbidding hole in the side of the hill. He warned them about the dangers ahead, the unstable ground, the possibility of cave-ins. "It's not a pleasant journey," he said, his voice low and urgent. "But it's better than staying here. Can you all do this?" They nodded, their eyes fixed on him. He was their only hope. He was the only one who knew these tunnels. As Coyote guided the group through the dark and twisting tunnels, he noticed a familiar face among them. It was Sarah Jenkins, the shopkeeper whose store he'd ransacked all those years ago. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes still held a spark of the fire he remembered. He avoided her gaze, ashamed of his past actions. But Sarah Jenkins stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. "Coyote," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I never thought I'd see you again." He mumbled an apology, his words barely audible. "I am sorry, Sarah, for what I did." Sarah Jenkins looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "That was a long time ago, Coyote," she said finally. "We all make mistakes." She paused, then continued, "But what you're doing now, helping us, that's something else. Thank you." Coyote was taken aback by her words. He didn't deserve her forgiveness, not after what he'd done. But her gratitude gave him a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could still redeem himself. They reached a fork in the tunnel. Coyote pointed to the right. "That way leads to the other side of the mountain," he said. "It's a long walk, but you'll be safe there." Sarah Jenkins didn't move. "What about you, Coyote?" she asked. "Are you coming with us?" He shook his head. "I can't," he said. "I have to stay." Sarah Jenkins looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "Stay?" she questioned, her voice barely audible. "Why?" His answer was the truth. "Because this town needs help." Sarah Jenkins stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Don't you see, Coyote?" she pleaded, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. "Running isn't the answer anymore. It hasn't been for a long time." She continued, "This town, it's more than just buildings and streets. It's people, families, trying to build a life. And Blacktooth is trying to take it all away." She paused, her eyes searching his. "You know how to fight, Coyote. You have skills that we don't. You may have been an outlaw, but you're the only one who can stop him." Coyote looked away, struggling with the weight of her words. He was an outlaw, a thief, a man who had caused nothing but trouble for Dust Gulch. He wasn't a hero. He didn't deserve to be a hero. "I'm not the right person, Sarah," he said, his voice low and strained. "I'm not a good man." Sarah Jenkins shook her head. "Good or bad, it doesn't matter now," she said. "What matters is what you do. What matters is whether you're willing to stand up and fight for what's right." She placed both her hands on his arms, her grip surprisingly firm. "Please, Coyote," she begged. "Don't let Blacktooth win. Don't let him destroy this town." Her words resonated deep within him, stirring something he thought had long been dead. A sense of responsibility, a desire to make amends, a yearning for redemption. For the first time in a long time, Coyote felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could be more than just an outlaw. Maybe he could be something better. The tunnels seemed to amplify the turmoil within him. The practical, survival-driven part of him screamed to leave. Blacktooth and his gang were brutal killers. Staying meant almost certain death. He had a life to protect, even if it was a life lived on the fringes. But Sarah's words, the image of the little girl's broken doll, the fear in the eyes of the townspeople, they all tugged at him with an irresistible force. He'd spent years running from his past, trying to outrun the guilt and shame that haunted him. But maybe, just maybe, facing Blacktooth was a way to finally confront those demons. He thought about the town he'd once terrorized. He thought about the damage he'd caused, the pain he'd inflicted. He could never undo what he'd done, but perhaps he could make amends. Perhaps he could use his skills, his knowledge of the town, to protect these people. The desire for redemption was a powerful lure. It offered him a chance to rewrite his story, to transform himself from a villain into something more. But it was a dangerous path, fraught with peril. Could he really trust himself to do the right thing? Could he overcome his own selfish instincts? He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The decision was his, and his alone. He could choose to run, to fade back into the shadows. Or he could choose to fight, to embrace the chance at redemption, no matter the cost. The silence in the tunnel was broken only by his ragged breathing, the sound of a soul hanging in the balance. He was about to bet his life on hope. Coyote opened his eyes, his gaze hardening with resolve. "I'll stay," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I'll help you." Sarah Jenkins nodded, a relieved smile spreading across her face. "Thank you, Coyote," she said. "I knew you wouldn't let us down." He turned and headed back towards the town, his mind already racing with plans. He knew he needed weapons, and he knew exactly where to find them. Years ago, before he'd left Dust Gulch, he'd stashed a cache of guns and ammunition in a hidden compartment beneath the old blacksmith shop. It was a long shot, but it was his best chance. He slipped back into town, moving like a shadow, avoiding the main street where the Blacktooth gang was still wreaking havoc. He reached the blacksmith shop, the building now partially in flames, and cautiously entered. He found the hidden compartment, relieved to discover that his stash was still intact. He retrieved 2 Colt revolvers, a Winchester rifle, and several boxes of ammunition. He strapped on the gun belt, the weight of the weapons feeling strangely comforting. He hadn't held a gun in years, but the feeling was still familiar, like an old friend. As he loaded the weapons, he began to formulate a plan. He knew he couldn't fight the Blacktooth gang head-on. He needed to use his knowledge of the town, his skills as an outlaw, to turn the tables on them. He would use their ruthlessness against them. He would make them pay for what they had done. His redemption had begun. Coyote knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, but convincing the frightened townspeople to stand and fight wouldn't be easy. He found Sheriff Bart, still bruised and humiliated, sitting slumped against the wall of the saloon. "Bart," Coyote said, his voice low but firm. "I need your help." Bart looked up, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You? Help? You're Coyote Carson. You're the reason this town's been cursed for years." "That was then," Coyote replied. "This is now. Blacktooth's gonna burn this town to the ground if we don't stop him. Are you with me? Or are you gonna sit here and watch it happen?" Bart hesitated, then slowly nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Together, they began to rally the remaining townspeople, appealing to their sense of pride and their desire to protect their homes and families. A few, emboldened by Coyote's presence and Bart's renewed sense of purpose, agreed to fight. Coyote quickly organized them, assigning them positions and teaching them basic defense tactics. He showed them how to use the town's layout to their advantage, using the narrow streets and buildings as cover. He taught them how to load and fire a gun, how to aim, and how to stay alive. He knew it was a long shot. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But they had one thing the Blacktooth gang didn't: a reason to fight. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their future. And with Coyote Carson leading the way, they just might have a chance. The Blacktooth gang, confident in their superior numbers and firepower, launched a full-scale assault on the town. They charged down the main street, firing their guns indiscriminately, expecting little resistance. But they were wrong. Coyote and his small band of defenders were waiting for them, hidden behind barricades and inside buildings, ready to fight. As the Blacktooth gang advanced, Coyote gave the signal, and the townspeople opened fire. The first volley took the Blacktooth gang by surprise. Several of them fell, wounded or dead, caught off guard by the unexpected resistance. The remaining members of the gang scrambled for cover, their initial confidence shattered. Coyote, moving quickly and skillfully, picked off several more members of the gang, his aim deadly accurate. He used his knowledge of the town to his advantage, flanking the enemy and exploiting their weaknesses. Sheriff Bart, his face grim but determined, fought bravely alongside Coyote, inspiring the other townspeople with his courage. Even Sarah Jenkins, armed with a shotgun, joined the fight, defending her store with a fierce determination. The battle raged for several hours, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and desperate cries. But against all odds, Coyote and the townspeople managed to repel the first wave of attack, inflicting heavy casualties on the Blacktooth gang. The victory, though hard-fought, boosted the morale of the townspeople. They had stood up to Blacktooth and his gang, and they had won. For the first time since the attack began, they felt a glimmer of hope. But Coyote knew that this was just the beginning. Blacktooth would be back, and he would be even more ruthless than before. Blacktooth watched from the outskirts of town, his face contorted with rage. He couldn't believe that a handful of farmers and shopkeepers had managed to repel his attack. He'd underestimated them, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. "Burn it all," he roared, his voice echoing across the town. "Burn Dust Gulch to the ground. Leave nothing standing." He ordered his men to gather every flammable material they could find: oil, kerosene, wood, anything that would burn. He wanted to send a message, a clear and unmistakable warning to anyone who dared to defy him. The Blacktooth gang, fueled by Blacktooth's fury and their own bloodlust, began to spread through the town, setting fire to buildings, homes, and businesses. The air filled with the smell of smoke and the crackling of flames. Coyote and his defenders watched in horror as Dust Gulch began to burn. They knew that if the fire spread unchecked, the entire town would be consumed, and they would have no chance of survival. He turned to Bart, his face grim. "We have to stop them," he said. "If we don't, it's all over." They gathered the remaining townspeople, their faces etched with fear and desperation, and prepared for the final stand. They knew that they were facing overwhelming odds, but they were determined to fight to the bitter end. They would not let Blacktooth destroy their town without a fight. Their hopes were slim, but so was Blacktooth's chance of victory. Coyote stepped out into the street, his face grim, his eyes fixed on Blacktooth. The burning buildings cast long, flickering shadows, creating an eerie and dramatic backdrop for the confrontation. Blacktooth, standing amidst his gang of outlaws, grinned cruelly. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it isn't Coyote Carson, I heard you were back in town. Thought you'd be long gone by now." "I'm not going anywhere," Coyote replied, his voice steady. "This is my town, and I'm not going to let you destroy it." Blacktooth laughed. "Your town? You're an outlaw, Carson. You have no claim to this town." "Maybe not," Coyote said, "but these people do, and I'm going to protect them." "You can't stop me, Carson," Blacktooth sneered. "I have more men, more guns, and more will to win than you'll ever have." "Maybe," Coyote said, "but you don't have what they have, a reason to fight. They're fighting for their homes, their families, their future. You're just fighting for greed." "Greed is all that matters, Carson," Blacktooth said. "It's the only thing that motivates people. You can talk about homes and families all you want, but in the end, everyone's just looking out for themselves." "That's where you're wrong, Blacktooth," Coyote said. "There's more to life than greed. There's loyalty, compassion, and a sense of community. Things you'll never understand." Blacktooth scowled. "Enough talk, Carson," he said. "Let's finish this." "Gladly," Coyote replied, drawing his guns. "Let's see who's right." The fate of Dust Gulch rested on this moment. The air crackled with tension as Coyote and Blacktooth faced each other. Then, with a roar, Blacktooth signaled his gang to attack. The final battle for Dust Gulch had begun. Gunfire erupted, filling the streets with a deafening cacophony. The townspeople, fighting with a ferocity born of desperation, traded shots with the Blacktooth gang, bullets whizzing through the air. Coyote moved with lightning speed, his guns blazing, taking down one outlaw after another. He used his knowledge of the town to his advantage, darting through alleys, scaling rooftops, and flanking the enemy. Sheriff Bart, despite his injuries, fought bravely, rallying the townspeople and inspiring them to fight on. Sarah Jenkins, armed with her shotgun, defended her store with unwavering courage. But the Blacktooth gang was relentless. They pressed their attack, setting more buildings on fire and overwhelming the townspeople's defenses. The battle raged for hours, with heavy losses on both sides. Several townspeople fell, their sacrifices buying valuable time for the others. Coyote watched in horror as one of his defenders was shot down, his life extinguished in a flash of gunfire. He knew that they couldn't hold out much longer. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. If they didn't do something drastic, they would all be killed. The town was burning. He could not let it fall. Coyote knew that the only way to save Dust Gulch was to take down Blacktooth himself. He signaled to Bart, who nodded in understanding, and then charged towards the center of town, drawing the attention of the remaining members of the Blacktooth gang. He fought his way through the chaos, dodging bullets and taking down outlaws with deadly precision. He moved with a speed and skill that surprised even himself, his outlaw instincts kicking in. Finally, he reached Blacktooth, who was standing in the middle of the street, watching the town burn with a satisfied grin. "It's over, Blacktooth," Coyote said, his voice low and menacing. "It ends here." Blacktooth laughed. "You can't beat me, Carson. I'm too powerful." "We'll see about that," Coyote replied, drawing his guns. The two men faced each other, the tension between them palpable. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, they drew their weapons and began to fire. Coyote, with his superior gunfighting skills and strategic thinking, quickly gained the upper hand. He dodged Blacktooth's shots and fired back with deadly accuracy, hitting him several times. Blacktooth staggered, his face contorted with pain and rage. He tried to fire back, but his aim was wild and erratic. Coyote moved in for the kill, firing a final shot that struck Blacktooth in the chest. The ruthless gang leader crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally over. His eyes were wide with shock. With Blacktooth defeated, the remaining members of his gang lost their will to fight. They had relied on his leadership, his ruthlessness, and his promise of riches. Now that he was gone, they had nothing left to fight for. They scattered, fleeing into the darkness, abandoning their weapons and their loot. Some were captured by the townspeople, but most managed to escape, disappearing into the vast expanse of the Wild West. The attack on Dust Gulch was finally over. The town was in ruins, many buildings burned to the ground, and many lives lost. But the townspeople had survived. They had stood up to a ruthless gang of outlaws, and they had won. Coyote stood in the middle of the street, his guns still smoking, surveying the scene of devastation. He felt a sense of exhaustion, but also a sense of satisfaction. He had done what he had to do. He had saved Dust Gulch. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. They gathered around Coyote, praising his courage and thanking him for his help. Sheriff Bart stepped forward, extending his hand. "You did good, Coyote," he said. "You saved us all." Coyote shook his hand, a rare smile spreading across his face. "We did it together, Bart," he said. "We all saved Dust Gulch." He had found something worth fighting for, and, in the process, found himself. As dawn broke over Dust Gulch, the extent of the devastation became clear. Many buildings were reduced to smoldering ruins, and the streets were littered with debris. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and ash. But amidst the destruction, there was also a sense of hope. The townspeople had survived. They had faced their darkest hour, and they had emerged victorious. They began to pick through the rubble, salvaging what they could. They helped each other, sharing food, water, and whatever supplies they could find. They mourned their dead, but they also celebrated their victory. A makeshift celebration was held in the town square, with the townspeople gathering around a bonfire, sharing stories and singing songs. They laughed, they cried, and they remembered those who had been lost. The little girl whose doll had been destroyed approached Coyote, offering him a small, handmade flower. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You saved my town." Coyote accepted the flower, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't deserve their gratitude, not after what he had done in the past. But he accepted it nonetheless, knowing that he had finally earned a measure of redemption. Dust Gulch was damaged, but it was not broken. The townspeople were resilient, and they were determined to rebuild their lives. They would never forget the day that Blacktooth attacked, but they would also never forget the day that Coyote Carson returned and saved them all. They would rebuild and never let anyone harm them again. Despite being hailed as a hero, Coyote knew he could never truly escape his past. He was still an outlaw, a wanted man. He couldn't stay in Dust Gulch, not permanently. He knew too many people were looking for him, but he had found something in Dust Gulch that he had been searching for his entire life, a sense of purpose. He had used his skills, his knowledge, to protect innocent people, to make amends for his past sins. He knew that he would never be completely free of his demons, but he had learned to live with them. He had found a measure of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could be a better man. He spent a few more days in Dust Gulch, helping the townspeople rebuild their homes and their lives. He worked alongside them, sharing their burdens and offering his support. He taught the young men of the town how to defend themselves, how to shoot straight, and how to stand up for what was right. He wanted to make sure that Dust Gulch would never be vulnerable again. He saw the little girl running and playing with the other children, her laughter filling the air. He smiled, knowing that he had played a small part in ensuring her future. He knew that it was time for him to leave. He couldn't stay in Dust Gulch forever, but he would never forget the town or the people who had given him a chance at redemption. He knew, deep down, that he was a changed man. He had faced the past and was ready for the future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, Coyote saddled his horse and prepared to leave. The townspeople gathered to see him off, their faces filled with gratitude and respect. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, offering him a warm smile. "Thank you, Coyote," she said. "You gave us our town back." Coyote nodded, his heart filled with emotion. "You gave me something too, Sarah," he said. "You gave me a chance to be a better man." He turned to Sheriff Bart, extending his hand. "Take care of this town, Bart," he said. "It's worth fighting for." Bart shook his hand firmly. "We will, Coyote," he said. "We will never forget what you did for us." Coyote mounted his horse, taking one last look at Dust Gulch. The town was still scarred by the attack, but it was also filled with a renewed sense of hope and determination. He turned his horse and rode off into the sunset, leaving Dust Gulch to rebuild. He knew that he would never be completely free of his past, but he also knew that he had found a new path, a path that led towards redemption. Dust Gulch would forever be changed by his unexpected act of heroism, and he would forever be changed by his time in Dust Gulch. He was still an outlaw, but he was also something more, a hero, a protector, and a man who had finally found peace. As he rode into the setting sun, he knew that his journey was far from over, but he was ready for whatever the future held. He was finally free,